The Ford Model T ended production in 1927 and is possibly the most influential creation in American history. The Ford Model T, and Henry Ford as a whole, had an incredible impact on the U.S. economy, one that we're still feeling to this day. But the foundation that built the Model T was the Model K. The Ford Model K was produced for just 3 years, but the Model K was secretly the reason for Ford's impact on the American automobile market. What you are watching is assembly line production in its infancy. That same infant that would drive Ford Motor Company into an American corporate powerhouse, one car at a time. But that one car would build the backbone of the new U.S. economy. To begin our story properly, we'll have to go to the historical Ford plant at 461 Paquette Street in Detroit, Michigan. It's the year 1905. Ford Motor Company was founded a couple summers ago, and Henry Ford is 39 years old. Up until this point, the only vehicles Ford had ever produced were 2-cylinder and 4-cylinder commuting vehicles. What Ford has in the works is going to change the company forever. Ford had been designing 2 new automobiles to replace their original fleet, the Model N and the Model K. The Model N was rather unremarkable as far as its impact, just like the Model K, mainly being an updated version of what Ford had already been producing. But the Model K was just a little bit different. Contrary to popular belief, the Ford Model K was absolutely not a failure. In 1907, the Model K was not only the best-selling 6-cylinder vehicle of all time, it also broke that record after 500 Model Ks were produced that year, and raked in the vast majority of Ford's profits from new vehicles during its short production run. Henry Ford, for a time, hated the idea of the Model K. Ever since Henry Ford had started building and designing automobiles in 1896, Henry Ford hadn't built an automobile with more than 4 cylinders. A heavy, luxurious, and expensive automobile was a far cry from the Model Bs, Cs, and Fs of Ford's yesteryear. The Model K was such a dispute, in fact, that Henry Ford's founding partner, Alexander Malcolmson, left the company. It seems that, even at such an early time for automobiles, failure was around every corner, as the Model K ultimately did not pave the way for the 6-cylinder success. It would be over 30 years until we got another 6-cylinder Ford.
Two deluxe lines of beautiful big new cars. The Deluxe Ford with breathtaking new beauty.
In 1941, 3 million vehicles were produced in the United States. In 1942, 1 million vehicles were produced for the first 2 months of the year. From February 15th, 1942 to September 2nd, 1945, only 139 automobiles were built in the United States. The impact that the Second World War had on the automobile industry will likely never be rivaled ever again. But we did get maybe one thing from World War II. Just before the United States had declared war on Imperial Japan, Henry Ford had just shipped out almost 700,000 1941 Fords. And these 41 Fords came available with a 226 cubic inch flathead straight 6, capable of producing up to 90 horsepower. Although Ford had developed some V8s during our time skip, including the additional options of a 221 or 239 cubic inch flathead V8 in the pre-war 41 model, these V8s were never as capable or efficient as the 6-cylinder. The 226, as presented in the 41 Ford, has a 4.4 inch stroke and a 3.3 inch bore. The 226 also offered a 12-port exhaust that was also rather prone to heat issues, a single camshaft with overhead valves, one single-barrel Holley-type carburetor with a manual choke, and a cast iron block and cast iron heads, as well as a steel crankshaft. The 226 proved to be a market success, and the 41 Ford sold exceptionally well and was used for the entirety of the production span for the deluxe trim. For the first time in Ford's 38-year existence, they had successfully designed a relatively reliable and efficient 6-cylinder. In fact, This was the first time anybody had ever utilized a 6-cylinder engine for any automobile at this level ever. The 1941 to 1948 226 was named the G Series, but as Ford released a new model in 1949, the 226 was enhanced into the H Series. The H Series is extremely similar to the G Series, as they are identical in displacement, including stroke and bore. Ford, however, slightly increased the compression to 6.8 to 1, increasing the efficiency and power of the engine. The 49 Ford's H Series 226 was offered alongside the 239 V8, outperforming the 8-cylinder in torque and almost matching it in horsepower, making it arguably the more capable option. And in our time, seeing a 6-cylinder outperform an 8-cylinder, especially in a sedan, is crazy. The first generation Ford F-Series was equipped with the same H-Series 226 as the 1949 Ford. In 1950, Ford made a sequel to their straight six, lowering the displacement to 215 cubic inches, increasing the compression to 7 to 1, improving the power output to 101 horsepower and about 185 pound-feet of torque. The 215 was also one of the first engines in North America to use the overhead cam design. Both the 226 and 215 were offered with the first generation for the Ford F-Series. In 1950, Ford also made another variation of the G Series. Ford began production of the 254, which was their diesel rendition of the flathead 226 format. The 254 was used to power large cab-over trucks and Ford school buses. The second generation of the new Ford Straight Six began immediately after the first one ended in 1952. Ford brought back the 215 and the 52 Ford alongside the option for the Ford 239 and later an overhead valve design of the Ford 239 in 1954. The 52 Ford also was the first Ford offered with an automatic transmission in the 3-speed Ford-O-Matic transmission designed by Borg-Warner. The second generation of the Ford F-Series, or the Triple Economy Series, was in production from 1953 to 1956 and featured not only the 215, but also the larger 223. The 223 would ultimately replace the 215 as Ford's flagship 6-cylinder engine. In 1954, the 223 put down 115 horsepower in the F-Series and 120 in the 54 model year for the 52 Ford. Power was further increased in the final model year to 137 horsepower. After the second generation of Ford Straight Sixes gained even more popularity, people were praising them for their reliability and efficiency all over the world. Ford also designed the Ford 262, which was used for mid and full-size trucks. The Ford 262 wasn't very successful, but it was deemed to be at least fairly valuable at the time because of its high power output and the interchangeable components. The early 262's heads are interchangeable on 215 and 223 blocks, which is pretty cool. The Ford 223 served as the entry-level engine option in Ford cars and trucks until the second generation of straight sixes were discontinued in 1960. As the third generation rolled around a few years later, the Ford 6-cylinders were considerably lowered in displacement, such as the Ford 144. The Ford 144 kept the OHV layout in cast iron assembly, but the stroke was shortened by almost 2 inches and the bore was expanded to 3.5 inches. The power output dropped considerably to just 84 horsepower and about 130 pound-feet of torque. The 144 was only produced for 4 years from 1960 to 1964 for the Ford Falcon. Ford also stroked the Ford 144 into the Ford 170 thrift power for use in the Ford Falcon and Ford Comet between 1961 and 1972. The Ford 170 was also briefly used in the 1964 Ford Mustang. In 1962, Ford made a giant leap by designing their first V6. This series of engines was named the Ford Cologne, and it was a series of cast iron block V6s. Ford's first iteration of this was their 121 cubic inch or 2-liter Cologne V6 introduced in 1964. But like many of the other small displacement Cologne 6-cylinders, it was only used in Europe. The Ford 200 thrift power was designed in 1963 and was inspired off of the design of the 170. The 200 had a slightly larger bore and stroke than the 170 and was also an enlarged block taken from the Ford 144. The Ford 200 is the most successful and influential Ford 6-cylinder we've covered thus far and was used as the entry-level option for the original Ford Mustang, rated at 120 horsepower for the 1965 model year. In 1971, the Mustang would unfortunately cut ties with the Ford 200, but the Ford 250 was used until 1973, after the first generation Mustang ended production. The fourth and final generation of the Ford Straight Six began surprisingly around the same time that third gens were still being put into the Mustang. The fourth generation was Ford's most impactful, as the Ford 240 and Ford 300 were produced for almost 30 years. The 240 and 300 were used extensively as generators and pumps and many other types of industrial machinery. The Ford 240 is capable of producing 150 horsepower when stationary, and the 300 packs about 170. The Ford 300 was originally built to be used in the Ford F-Series as a 240/300. The 240 and 300 also have several interchangeable components, including the heads, even despite the fact that the 300 has larger combustion chambers than the 240. The Ford 300 is easily one of the most famous Ford engines of all time. It is known for its durability, simplicity, and its impressive torque numbers, but also for its bulletproof design and longevity. But this would clear the way for the new Cologne line. The Cologne V6 was born in Germany, and the series had been produced exclusively for Ford Europe, which left a V6-sized gap in Ford's American fleet. The Ford Cologne V6 wouldn't even enter the American market until 1973, when the Mustang II was offered with a 2.8-liter. The 2.8-liter Cologne was based off of the German 2.6-liter, but with 3 port heads instead of 2 and a bored-out block for larger displacement. The 2.8-liter Cologne was produced carbureted with electronic fuel injection and with mechanical fuel injection throughout its product span. The 2.8-liter Cologne produces about 130 horsepower while carbureted and 158 horsepower with Bosch mechanical injection. The larger 2.9-liter Cologne was very similar to the 2.8 but with some minor changes, such as in the 2.9 the cam was switched to being chain-driven instead of gear-driven. The 2.9-liter Cologne is known for being in the classic Ford Ranger. To replace the outdated Cologne V6s of the 70s and 80s, Ford released the 2.9-liter Cosworth V6, a dual overhead cam version of the 2.9-liter Cologne produced by Cosworth Engineering in 1991. The Cosworth 2.9 was boosted all the way to 192 horsepower and just over 200 pound-foot of torque. While the 2.9-liter Cologne found success in the Ranger, Ford began producing the Vulcan series of V6 engines starting in 1986. The Vulcan V6 was produced primarily as a successor for their mid-size sedans and wagons. In the 1986 model year, it was offered in the Ford Taurus and the Mercury Sable. The Vulcan was the first Ford V6 to be offered with a turbocharger, which, once again, is a staple of the Duratec series. In fact, the Vulcan V6 was the platform that the 3-liter Duratec would be built on. The Vulcan found major success in the Aerostar, Taurus, Sable, and the Ranger, but the Cologne was only getting stronger. Ford also designed a much larger 4-liter Cologne V6, produced throughout the 90s, meant for the Ford Ranger and Mazda B series. Although the 4-liter Cologne was produced exclusively in Germany, it was only ever outfitted to American vehicles. The 4-liter Cologne from the early 90s has been rated to be good for about 150 to 160 horsepower. In the year 2000, the Cologne 4-liter was redesigned for a single overhead cam platform, with power being increased further to just about 200 horsepower. It features an interesting variable length intake manifold and even uses a jack shaft. From 1997 to 2011, the 4-liter Cologne made a name for itself as one of the greatest 6-cylinder engines of all time, and in my opinion, it is the best V6 format engine ever made. Today, a vast majority of Ford vehicles come with an optional V6. The Duratec tenure of V6 engines has not only revolutionized the way engines are designed, but also is incredibly efficient while doing so. Ford's ability to persevere and survive is truly amazing. Having existed for over 120 years, Ford is one of the oldest in the world, and it shows. Ford's V6 is so great because it has been refined over the course of a century. Henry Ford's vision is almost transparent through these incredibly efficient engines, and that's when you come to find out that Henry Ford's dream really did come true. Thank you for watching.